Okay, for today, let me introduce you to the number I. Right, it looks like a letter, but it's really a number. Now we call it imaginary number. So for imaginary, we're not that creative in math, so we just really call it I. Now the important thing of I, like why is I so important? Now the important thing of I is that I to the second power, right? There's this number I, it's an imaginary number. We're just gonna call it I, when I multiply it by itself, so I times I, so I squared is going to equal to -1. So I'm not saying I is +1 or I is -1, right? Because if it was +1, 1 times 1 is not equal to -1. If it was -1, right, negative times a negative, it will not be -1. So I is not 1, I is I. Right? I squared, I to the second power is equal to -1. So the important thing of I is basically the square root of 1. We're going to be dealing with radicals, right? Some people call it square roots. So we're going to be dealing with radicals this week. So I want to deal with I to the second. Now, I to the 1, when we simplify I to the 1, I'm going to say is just I, right? Anything to the 1 is just that number. I to the second power, I just said is -1. Now, I to the third, let me simplify I to the third. I could break this. I know how to break exponents. This is I squared times I to the 1, because remember how when we combine exponents, we just add the exponent. So 2 plus 1 gives me 3. But I can also split it. I know I to the second is a -1. I to the 1 is just I. So I'm going to say that I to the third simplifies to -I. Notice how I wrote this without exponents. My answers, when you notice, I'm writing without exponents. Now, I to the fourth is just going to go, let me split this as I squared times I squared. I know I to the second is a -1. So I'm looking at -1 times a -1. So I'm going to say I to the fourth is 1. Interesting. So notice how they simplify each to a term that has no exponents. I to the 1 is I to the 2 is -1, I to the 3 is -I, and then I to the fourth is 1. Now, what would happen if I do I to the fifth? I'm going to break this as I to the fourth times I to the 1. I know I to the fourth is 1, right? Just did that earlier. And I know I to the 1 is I. So 1 times I is just I. I to the sixth, I can break that as I to the fourth times I to the second. I know I to the fourth is 1. I to the second is a -1. So 1 times a -1. Now I to the seventh, I can break that as I to the fourth times I to the 3. I know I to the fourth is 1. I to the 3, I know is a -I. So 1 times a -I is -I. I to the eighth, I can break that as I to the fourth times I to the fourth, which is basically 1 times 1. So this is 1. Let me highlight my answers here. You guys see how they repeat? So if it came down to it, I'm going to say I to the ninth is going to simplify to I to the 10th is going to simplify to -1, I to the 11th is going to simplify to -I, and I to the 12th is going to simplify to just 1. Note, you guys see my repetition here? You guys see my pattern here? To be honest, what I'm going to do, if I have an exponent, because what if I go something really crazy? What if I go I to the let's say 31. Right, I'm not going to make this list all the way to 31. What I'm going to do, I want to simplify my exponent. I notice that every exponent to the fourth, there's a repetition. So I want to subtract from 31 a multiple of 4. Okay, so multiple of 4. So that's like 4, 8, 12. All right, I want to add or subtract a multiple of 12. To be honest, I want to simplify this as I to the 1, I to the 2, I to the 3, or I to the 4th. And the reason why I want to simplify to that is because I know my answers already. Let me subtract the 28. So that gives me I to the 3rd. So again, notice how I subtracted or added a multiple of 4. And I to the 3rd, I will simplify to just as a negative I. Right? That's what I'm going to do. So let's take a look at some of our examples here. On the instructions, I'm even going to say simplify the imaginary numbers, no exponents. Before I move on, when I said according to our list, this is the list that I referred to, okay? So make sure you guys take a look on your notes. When I say according to our list, this is what I mean. So I to the 1, I to the 2, I to the 3, and I to the 4th. Those are very, very important keys. So I want to do I to the 34. I'm going to add or subtract that multiple of 4. So in this case, let me subtract 32 from my exponent. Right, 34 minus 32 gives me I to the 2nd. So see how I simplified it. Now I to the 2nd, according to my list, my answer will be negative 1. All right, let's take a look at 74. Let me subtract the multiple of 4. Let me go 44. That's going to give me I to the 0. Okay, I need to have my exponent as either I to the 1, I to the 2, I to the 3, or I to the 4. Seems like I subtracted a little too much. So let me add 4 more. So that gives me I to the 4th. So I guess instead of subtracting 44 to begin with, I should have subtracted 40. Okay, my exponent needs to be I to the 1, I to the 2, I to the 3, or I to the 4th. According to our list, I to the 4th simplifies to just 1. Okay, let's take a look at number 75. In this case, let me add 20. Let me add a 20 to my exponents. Remember I said add or subtract a multiple of 4. So let me add a 20 to my exponent. So that simplifies to I to the 3rd. Now, according to our list, I to the 3rd simplifies to negative I. Lastly here, I'm going to give you a clue. One thing real quick. Multiples of 100. 4 is a multiple of 100. So here, let me add 300. So that gives me I to the negative 27th. Some of your exponents are going to be in the hundreds. Add or subtract the hundreds. 100, 200, 300. All the hundreds are multiples of 4. Okay, so I'm still in the minus 27, and so I have to add more. Let me add 28 because I'm going to add a multiple of 4. So this simplifies to I to the 1. According to our list, I to the 1, my answer is just going to be I. Let me emphasize that on the answers, none of them have an exponent. So that's why I said on instructions, no exponents. Okay. Now, let me simplify radicals. You guys are familiar with square roots, right? You guys know what's the square root of 4. You guys know what's the square root of 9. You guys know what's the square root of 16. You guys know what's the square root of 25, 36, 49, 64, right? 81, 100. You guys are familiar with perfect squares. Yeah, well, those are nice, right? Because they simplify to whole numbered. Right, the square root of 4, I'm looking at which number multiplied by itself is equal to 4. So it's the square root of 4 is 2, the square root of 9 is 3, the square root of 16 is 4. Right, perfect squares are nice, but what about the square root of 45? Or even more, what's the square root of a negative 45? Okay, so first of all, cool thing is that radicals, we can split them up. So 45, I'm going to split it as a multiplication. I'm going to split this as negative 1 times 45. The negative 1, because I know what's the square root of negative 1. Let me remind you. Let me come back to our notes. I know what's the square root of negative 1. Okay. So that's why I wanted to do that. I know what's the square root of negative 1. Now 45, I can split it even more. So let me say that I have the square root of negative 1, but square root of 45, I'm going to split it as 2 radicals. Okay, I'm going to think of 2 numbers that multiplied are equal to 45, but one of my numbers has to be a perfect square. Okay, what do I mean with perfect squared? Has to be either 4, has to be 9, 16, 25, 36, 49. So it's not just any 2 numbers. One of them has to be a perfect square. So I cannot go 3 times 15, right? Because neither the 3 nor the 15 are perfect squares. But I can go 9 times 5 because one of them is a perfect square. Okay, so I know that the square root of negative 1 is I, right? We know that. I know the square root of 9 is 3. Now the square root of 5, there's nothing we can do. So my answer will be 3i square root of 5. Notice that everything that came out, I put it at the front. Now, when there's a number and there's a letter, so or a number and an imaginary number, put the real number first. So it's 3i, not I3, 3i. For us to begin with, for today, I want us to just worry about how to simplify. So I'm not going to talk about how to type this in. For today's homework, I'm going to give it to you in multiple choice. I want you to understand how to do it. Starting tomorrow, we're going to have to type the whole thing. It's not going to be multiple choice. But for today, it will be multiple choice. Again, I want you to learn how to simplify. That's my focus for today. All right, let's take a look at question number 78. Let me break this to begin with as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 144. I know square root of negative 1 is I, so that's going to be cool. Now, some of you are like, can I break this as 4 times 36? Okay, yeah, because 4 is a perfect square, but 36 is also perfect square. So I know this is going to be I. I know the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of 36 is 6. Okay, so what happens when we have more than one whole number? Have 2 and 6. So my answer will be 12i. Notice I multiply the 2 and the 6. Some of you like, oh, yeah, the square root of 144 was 12 to begin with. It's okay if you break it. You can just multiply it back up. So now this one, notice how there's no radicals left. Yeah, because this was a perfect square to begin with, right? We call those perfect squares because my answer doesn't have a square root anymore. So 12i. When there's a number and an I, make sure you write the real number first, the 12. All right, let's take a look at number 79. I'm going to break this as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 8. Now, 8 is not a perfect square, so I'm going to split that a little bit more. Okay, so I have the square root of -1, but 8, I'm going to break it as 4 times 2. I know the square root of -1 is I. I know the square root of 4 is 2. So my answer would be 2I radical 2. Lastly, let's take a look at number 80. Now this one, I'm not going to factor a -1 out. This is just a positive. So I'm just going to break this into two radicals. Two numbers that multiplied equals 150. Do not think 15 times 10. I know 15 times 10 is 150, but one of my numbers, remember I said one of my numbers has to come from this list. So 10 times 15 doesn't work. Instead, I'm going to think 25 times 6. Because the square root of 25 does come from the list. All right, square root of 25 I know is 5. So my answer will be 5 radical 6. I don't have an I this time because I didn't have a negative inside the radical. So now you guys just learn how to deal with square root of negatives. Let me zoom out so you guys understand this real quick.